Introduction. This is the 8th old yarn on Albert.net, following in the footsteps of the Chinelli jumpsuit, bike crash on Golden Gate Bridge, the enemy coach, the brash noob, the day I learned bicycle gear shifting, the in-flight voyeur, and most recently, the dark alley incident. This is the kind of true story that would normally be a from the archives item, except I've never before written it down. The police raid, early 1994. I was living in an apartment on Webster Street in San Francisco's Western Addition, aka Lower Haight. At the time I felt like it was a fairly safe neighborhood, but more recently I've discovered that, at that time, it was actually pretty rough. I'd found the place through a buddy at the Berkeley bike shop where I'd worked until I graduated from college. Our other roommate, R, was the one who had the lease, and I didn't know much about him, except that he was about 10 years older than us, and made his living buying broken-down cars from the police auction and then fixing and selling them. He had a lot of spare time, which he spent entertaining friends, cooking, watching TV, and smoking weed. I wasn't too wild about R's lifestyle, especially the weed part, but he was a nice guy. Noting my predilection for making burritos, he'd buy chips and really good salsa from some local taqueria or Mexican grocery and exhort me to help myself to them. He was generally in pretty good spirits, laughing at all kinds of stuff. He had a great tabby cat, whose official name was Pogo, but whom A and I called Toonces. Toonces took a shine to me and would sleep in my bed, a queen-size futon that took up almost my entire bedroom. My racing bike hung right above the futon, and I hung my dress shirts and neckties from its front wheel. R's main visitors, for most of the time I lived there, were his girlfriend, his mistress, and another female friend who was a stripper. I don't even remember his girlfriend's name, and other than her looks I don't know what R saw in her. She had this dog named Dakota she'd always bring with her, and about 90% of her verbal output was bawling out the dog. Dakota. No. The mistress, M, wasn't nearly as pretty, but was a totally cool chick. We all liked her a lot. I don't remember the stripper's name either. She was nice, but pretty quiet and mostly just watched TV. I think R only had her over to give her a place to relax and recharge. I gather she had a hard life. Over time, things started to go downhill. A moved out, and R rented the room out to some random guy who was stressed out all the time because he managed a restaurant. This guy had a female cat, Chloe, who was in heat and always coming on to Toonces, apparently unaware that she was also female. Chloe would always stick her hind end in Toonces' face, and Toonces would stalk away, disgusted. Eventually, Chloe got herself knocked up from some off-screen neighborhood tomcat, and had a litter of kittens that our roommate couldn't manage to unload on anyone, so they just pissed everywhere until it became untenable and R kicked the guy out, kittens and all. Then we got some freshly minted journalism grad from Oklahoma, who didn't seem to have a job and just hung around, mainly watching R's giant TV, always with this kind of awkward trying to be friendly smile plastered to his face. Meanwhile, R's weed use appeared to go from a special treat, to a routine indulgence, to a lifestyle. M started to get a bit grumpy, chafing at her ongoing role of mistress versus her hope of pushing out the girlfriend. Worst of all, R got in the habit of having friends over and smoking them out, and this collection of friends seemed to grow over time to where there always seemed to be some stranger in my living room. It became kind of a menagerie of dirtbags. I tolerated all of this because the rent was dirt cheap, and I was saving up as much money as possible for a 9-month bicycle tour I was planning with my then-girlfriend, E. I was spending a lot of my time at E's place anyway, and as our story begins, I was in my last week living at the Webster place, and had already started moving my stuff into storage. On the night in question, my dad was in town with his then-wife, and had offered to take E and me out to dinner. I got home a bit early from work, just after sunset, so I'd have time to change out of my suit and tie and shake off the workday before my dad picked me up. The apartment was an upstairs unit, so just past the front door was a steep flight of stairs. As I came through the door, R stuck his head out over the stairwell and yelled, "Don't come in!" I was gobsmacked. On what grounds could or would my roommate say this? I mean, I live here. I pay rent. As I stood there paralyzed with confusion, another head popped out, that of a complete stranger, who yelled, "Freeze! Police! Are you armed?" I guess you could say I'd lived a charmed life up to that moment, because it didn't occur to me that this could actually be a cop. I mean, it didn't even cross my mind. It felt like these two must have been having me on. So I replied, "Are you kidding?" At this, the cop, for it was in fact a plainclothes cop, came running down the stairs toward me. And yes, he was packing heat, but at least it was holstered. I put my hands up and said something like, "I'm really sorry, officer, but can you tell me what's going on?" He didn't answer, but gestured up the steps. "Get up there," he commanded. I was marched up to the living room. R was sitting on one end of the sofa, looking really pissed off and a bit freaked out. Our Oki roommate was seated at the other end of the sofa, looking absolutely petrified. There were 5 plainclothes cops tearing the place apart. I gathered this was a drug bust. I mean, what else could it be? Dumb luck that I happened to come home that evening. The energy off these cops was intense and kind of terrifying. They were dressed to blend in with the urban environment, jeans and dark windbreakers, and they were moving at a speed that didn't seem necessary, shoving things off bookcases, turning things over, yanking open drawers. They seemed pissed, like whatever they were looking for they weren't coming up with. The first cop demanded some ID. I very slowly drew my driver's license from my wallet and handed it over. He gave it to someone to run it. "What room is yours?" another cop asked. I pointed down the hall. He said, "Show me." I led him down there. When carrying my futon frame out a few days before, I'd lost my grip and it busted the light switch so I couldn't turn on the light. For that reason, I still had my big mag light in there. It was the big 4D cell version I'd bought for the upcoming bike tour, and I suddenly realized it wasn't where I'd left it. In fact, the cop at my shoulder was wielding a mag light, and I reckoned it was probably mine. Like in all the excitement, he didn't realize this wasn't his cop-issued one. I decided not to bring it up. "Where's all your stuff?" the guy demanded. I told him, "I'm moving out." He asked, "Why?" This was a bit of a tough one to answer. I'm sure he didn't want to hear a Doogie Howser response like, "I'm putting all my things in storage because I'm going to do a cross-country bike tour. It's going to be so much fun." But I also didn't want to sound like a smartass. I decided to take the risk and said, with a head nod toward my roommate in the living room, "Why do you think?" He asked why the light switch was broken. I explained. He marched me back into the living room. Just as I got there, the phone in the kitchen rang. I was like, "Oh crap, that's probably my dad." I turned to the guy who'd come down the stairs for me, whom I took to be the head cop, and said, "Hey, that's probably my dad calling. He's supposed to come over. Can I please answer, just to tell him not to come?" The cop stared at me for a couple seconds, as the phone continued to ring, and finally said, "Okay, but no funny stuff." I almost burst out laughing. Where did this guy get his script? From watching cop shows on TV? No funny stuff, seriously? What was I gonna say? The bird has flown, execute plan Bravo? But I kept a straight face and picked up the phone. It was E, asking, "Hey, are we still on for tonight?" I paused. What counted as funny stuff? Does mentioning the police raid violate some law enforcement taboo? I decided to be as vague as possible. "I'm not sure," I said carefully. "Things have gotten a bit complicated. Just stay put, and I'll be in touch." I rang off, and the cop seemed okay with what I'd said. Handing me back my driver's license, he sent me back into the living room, where a cop had finally found something at the back of a bookcase. A little baggie of mushrooms. R said, "Oh my God, there those are. I wondered where I'd stashed them." The head cop wheeled around to face him and yelled, "Oh, you think this is funny?" Now R looked properly terrified. I guess he'd been shooting for levity, but obviously that didn't work out. All this time, Toonses was sitting up on top of the giant TV, looking down across the scene. This was her favorite perch, since TVs still had tubes back then, so it was always nice and warm. One of the cops must have followed my gaze because he yelled at me, "What's the cat doing up there?" I couldn't believe he'd actually ask that. I mean, what a pointless question, right? I guess he was so hopped up on adrenaline he just needed to yell something. I meekly replied, She likes it up there." He fired back, "Does she always sit up there?" The very first thing that popped into my head as a response was, "No, only when she's stoned." But obviously after R's experiment I didn't even consider it. I just said, yeah, most of the time." The doorbell rang. Oh crap, my dad. Before I could do anything, the head cop ran down the stairs and threw open the door. "Freeze! Police! Are you armed?" I peered down the stairs to see my dad standing in the doorway, looking dumbfounded. At least he didn't look threatening, with his tidy gray beard, 90s-era Bill Gates eyeglasses, and tweed blazer. But he also didn't answer right away. He just stood there, and I could sense the cop's blood starting to boil. Finally, my dad said, in a very quiet, timid voice, "Is Dana here?" I said, "Are you armed?" The cop yelled. My dad assured him he was not. I took a gamble and came down the stairs. "This is my dad," I told the cop. "And here's the thing. You've run my license already, and you can see I have 0 criminal record. I have nothing to do with any of this, and my roommate probably already told you that. You guys have been through my room and there's nothing there. Can I please just leave with my dad?" The cop thought it over and decided to let me go. This was a very lucky break. I found out later my 2 roommates spent the night on that sofa, handcuffed together while the cops finished tearing the place apart. Before I left, I approached the cop who'd been in my room and politely asked if that was my maglite he was carrying. He acknowledged that it was. "Would you be willing to leave it in my room before you go?" I timidly asked. Looking back, this was probably pushing my luck. For some reason, my stepmother had parked a block or two away. As my dad and I walked to the car, I pondered what he must be thinking. This was not a cool dad with a wild past who had ever encountered anything like a drug bust. I mean, he was such a goody two-shoes he didn't even touch alcohol or use swear words. As for firearms, he'd never even let my brothers and me have toy guns. Famously, when he found a toy gun in our house, belonging to one of our friends, he snatched it up, took it out to the street in front of our house, and ran it over with his VW bus. My dad was a principled man, a gentleman, and a prig. Plainclothes cops were not part of his world. Not sure what to say, I remained quiet as we strolled down the sidewalk toward the car. My dad finally broke the silence. "Well," he said, "that was interesting.